The Orient Express sliced through the European night like a polished silver blade, its lamps glowing warmly against the dark winter landscape. Snowfall hung in the air like drifting ghosts, descending slowly as if the heavens themselves were reluctant to let the flakes fall. Inside the train, the world was different: bright carpets, polished brass, the faint scent of tobacco mixed with perfume, and the warm murmur of a dozen strangers who had boarded with luggage heavy not just with clothes but with secrets. It was a place where luxury embraced mystery, where each cabin could hide a life story, a motive, or a lie. Hercule Poirot, the world-famous detective with the immaculate mustache and an intellect sharper than diamond, sat quietly in his seat, reading a small book and occasionally glancing outside the window. His eyes, sharp and observant, caught every detail: the shimmer of snow under moonlight, the passing silhouettes of pine trees, and the distant mountains rising like ancient guardians. He was a man who rarely allowed himself rest, but tonight he intended to appreciate a rare moment of solitude. For once, he hoped the universe would allow him a peaceful journey, but Poirot knew better than to make such wishes. Crime followed him like a shadow, and shadows were thick tonight. Across the aisle, passengers chattered softly. A wealthy American businessman who looked perpetually irritated, a refined English governess with timid eyes, a countess whose elegance could disarm nations, a colonel who carried himself like a man burdened by distant battlefields. Each one seemed ordinary enough. Each one seemed harmless. And yet Poirot felt a subtle tension in the air, a vibration, a disturbance, like a violin string pulled just a touch too tight. He closed his book and folded his hands. Something was coming. He could feel it. The train glided forward with smooth confidence, but the night outside grew colder and heavier. Poirot's gaze drifted again toward the corridor where passengers moved about, a few whispering, others simply passing through. The detective observed the smallest gestures: a nervous finger tapping, a tension in a jawline, a glance too quickly averted. Human behavior was his specialty, his playground, and tonight, this luxurious train was a gallery of human expression. Poirot had not yet identified the source of the tension he felt, but his instincts, so rarely wrong, told him that something about this journey would not be ordinary. While he was deep in quiet thought, a sudden commotion stirred him from reflection. The American businessman insisted loudly that he required a specific cabin, claiming it was a matter of safety. His voice held an odd mixture of desperation and arrogance. The conductor attempted to pacify him, but Poirot noticed something: fear. True fear. The kind a guilty man or a hunted man carried. Poirot found himself studying the man. What danger haunted him? And why choose the Orient Express as a sanctuary? Other passengers turned their heads at the noise, some curious, others annoyed. The train, however, did not slow its course. Outside the windows, the world disappeared deeper into white. After several minutes, the businessman retreated to his compartment, grumbling under his breath. The corridor returned to silence. Poirot resumed his calm posture, but now he watched more closely. This was no ordinary disturbance. This man behaved like someone running from shadows, someone expecting an attack. The evening dinner brought the passengers together. Crystal glasses clinked softly, silverware chimed against porcelain, and warm golden lights gave the dining car a cozy glow. Conversations floated through the air, each one unique, each one colored by accents from across Europe and America. Poirot observed them all, politely engaging when addressed, but mostly listening. The American businessman sat alone, glancing over his shoulder between every bite. Paranoia wrapped around him like a cloak. Poirot's curiosity sharpened. Suddenly, the man rose and approached Poirot's table. With an attempt at a charming smile that failed miserably, he asked Poirot if they could speak privately. Poirot agreed politely, though he already sensed a request of an unpleasant nature approaching. They stepped into the narrow corridor, illuminated by soft yellow lamps. The businessman introduced himself, though Poirot doubted the name was real. The man lowered his voice and confessed he feared someone on this train wished to harm him. He had powerful enemies. He claimed dangerous individuals who might be willing to cross borders to reach him. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And you wish for protection, perhaps?" The man avoided eye contact. Maybe just someone to keep an eye out. Someone with your reputation. You see, I've made mistakes. I've offended people. Hurt them, even. And when a man's past comes looking, it rarely knocks nicely. Poirot asked for specific threats, details, names, but the businessman provided only vague answers, evasive statements, and half-truths. The detective recognized the pattern. This was a man with secrets too ugly to admit, even in desperation. Poirot gently dismissed him, advising him to rest but remain cautious. As the man turned away, Poirot felt certain the danger was real, but perhaps not for the reason the man believed. That night, the passengers settled in their cabins. The train hummed steadily, rocking gently as it glided across the tracks. The cold outside deepened, the storm intensifying. Poirot lay in his berth, not sleeping, only listening. His mind replayed every glance, every tone of voice, every peculiar movement in the dining car. And then he heard it, a muffled thud. A cry, then silence. Poirot sat up instantly. He knew the sound of a struggle, the sharpness of fear in a human voice. The cry had come from the direction of the American businessman's cabin. He waited, just long enough to distinguish between an imagined noise and a real one. Then he slipped into his slippers and stepped out into the corridor. The lights flickered slightly under the pressure of the storm, giving the hallway a haunting glow. The cabin door of the businessman was shut, curtains drawn. Poirot approached slowly, listening. Silence. Total, unnatural, heavy silence. He was about to knock when the train shuddered violently, grinding to a sudden halt. Poirot grabbed the wall rail to steady himself. The snowstorm outside had grown into a monstrous force, burying the tracks and forcing the train to stop in the middle of nowhere. Surrounded by icy wilderness, passengers awoke in confusion. Doors cracked open. Voices echoed down the corridor. Poirot's attention remained fixed on the businessman's door. Moments later, the conductor rushed by, announcing the unexpected stop. Poirot calmly informed him of the suspicious noise he'd heard earlier. The conductor knocked on the businessman's door, announcing himself, but no answer came. With growing concern, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. Poirot followed. The scene inside was unmistakable chaos frozen in time. Furniture disturbed. A glass shattered on the floor. Curtains tugged as though in a struggle. And on the bed lay the businessman, now deathly still, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as if he had seen something terrifying in his final moment. He was dead. The conductor gasped, stumbling back. Poirot stepped forward, his expression calm but grave. He examined the body with precision, noting the wound, the angle, the defensive marks, the signs of forced entry or lack thereof. It was all wrong. Too quiet. Too clean. Too intentional. Poirot stood upright, his eyes narrowing. This was no random killing. No simple act of violence. This was a message. A murder committed on a train trapped in a snowstorm. No escape. No outside intruder. No hiding place. Every passenger still on board. Every suspect locked within these luxurious walls. Poirot felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. The Orient Express had become a prison of secrets, a sealed chamber filled with strangers, lies and hidden motives. The detective took a slow breath. A murder, he whispered, almost to himself. And the killer is among us. The snowstorm howled outside, drowning the world in white dot inside. Hercule Poirot began the first steps of a journey that would become legendary. The snowstorm outside thickened into A white wall swallowing the world beyond the windows. The Orient Express sat motionless on the tracks, its once glorious confidence dimmed by nature's merciless grip. Inside the train, however, the atmosphere changed from cozy warmth to a heavy tension that wrapped itself around every passenger like an unseen hand. Word of the murder spread faster than the cold wind outside, whispering through corridors, slipping under doors, and jolting people from their comfortable illusions of safety. Hercule Poirot stood near the doorway of the crime scene, quietly observing as the conductor struggled to regain composure. His hands trembled slightly, whether from fear or shock, Poirot could not tell. The man's voice cracked as he apologized repeatedly, claiming he never expected such horror on the Orient Express. Poirot reassured him softly. Now was not the time for panic. Now was the time for order. He closed the cabin door gently behind him, sealing the silent body inside, and turned to face the corridor. Several passengers had already gathered, drawn by curiosity or fear, whispering urgently among themselves. Poirot saw uncertainty in their eyes, the uncomfortable realization that the murderer was not far away in some unknown darkness, but here, sharing the same narrow halls, breathing the same air. Poirot stepped forward, raising a hand for calm. "Madame and messieurs," he began in his steady voice, "a tragedy has occurred. But panic will help no one. We are safe for the moment, and every one of you will have an opportunity to speak with me." A few passengers nodded nervously. Others backed away, avoiding his gaze. Poirot's eyes swept across them, studying reactions, the stiff shoulders, the trembling lips, the too still faces. A murder always revealed more than a victim and a weapon. It revealed human nature itself. Before he began formal interviews, Poirot wanted something else: the first impressions. Those instinctive, unguarded expressions people wore before they had time to prepare lies. The first to step forward was the English governess, Miss Whitmore. Her voice quivered as she introduced herself. "Mr. Poirot, is it true? Has someone really been killed?" Poirot nodded gently. "I am afraid so." She looked genuinely horrified, her eyes darting nervously to every shadow. "But who would do such a thing? We were all dining together not long ago." Poirot saw no deception on her face, only shock. But shock often hid deeper truths, so he made no assumptions. Next came the colonel, a stern, weathered man with a rigid posture, as though he had marched through a lifetime of harsh realities. "You'll find who did this, I assume," he said gruffly, not fearful, merely irritated. A murderer on a train is not a situation that should be allowed to continue. Poirot gave him a slight nod. "But of course. That is why I must speak with each of you." Then the Countess approached, elegant, composed, carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had been trained since childhood to hide every emotion behind a polished facade. Her soft voice held the faintest tremor. "Monsieur Poirot, I trust you will uncover the truth. But surely no one among us would be capable of such savagery." Poirot met her eyes carefully. Her words were smooth, but her gaze was sharp, too sharp. She was analyzing him even as he analyzed her. One by one, the passengers offered thin fragments of their worry. A young man who claimed to be a journalist scribbled in a notebook, pretending to record details but clearly watching the others more than his page. An elderly woman clutched her handbag so tightly that her knuckles turned white, murmuring prayers under her breath. A quiet traveler from Istanbul kept his distance entirely, only bowing slightly to Poirot with a respectful yet unreadable expression. Everyone behaved normally. Everyone behaved too normally. That alone was suspicious. The conductor finally brought order to the crowd, insisting they return to their compartments until Poirot called for them. They dispersed reluctantly, their whispers echoing faintly as they disappeared into their rooms. Poirot lingered in the corridor, his mind gathering threads of information, weaving them into early theories that could shift at any moment. He began his investigation not with a person, but with a place, the murdered man's cabin. Inside, the body remained untouched, lying with unnatural stillness beneath the dim lamp that cast long shadows across the room. Poirot closed the door behind him and examined the scene with intense precision. His gaze swept over every detail: the position of the body, the scattering of broken glass on the carpet, the shape of the curtains pulled slightly off their hooks, the pattern of the sheets. Nothing was random. He crouched beside the bed, studying the wound. It was deep, clean, delivered with purpose. A single fatal strike. The killer either had experience or confidence. Poirot then examined the man's possessions: a hastily packed suitcase, a torn envelope, a small notebook containing coded references that made little sense at first glance, and tucked beneath the pillow, a concealed weapon, a pistol, but unused. Why would a man terrified for his life sleep with a gun at hand and yet fail to fire it? Poirot's mind sharpened, because he never had the chance, because the killer entered without warning, or worse, because he let the killer in. Poirot stood and inspected the window. Locked from the inside. No footprints outside in the snow. No forced entry through the door. A locked room scenario. Inside a train. Poirot felt the familiar thrill of challenge. Whoever committed this crime believed themselves clever, perhaps believing the storm would make the investigation impossible. But they underestimated the simple truth about confined spaces. On a train, a murderer has nowhere to disappear. He turned to the conductor. "Tell me, my friend, who had access to this cabin after dinner?" The conductor swallowed. "Besides the victim, only the passengers walking through the corridor." "And the staff?" "They stay in their assigned sections, unless called." Poirot tapped his chin. "Who among the passengers seemed uneasy earlier?" The conductor hesitated. Poirot observed the pause. The man was deciding whether to reveal something. Poirot encouraged him quietly. "Speak freely. Every detail matters." The conductor sighed. "Monsieur, earlier tonight, before dinner, I noticed someone speaking with the victim. Someone who looked upset." Poirot leaned slightly closer. "Who?" "Madame Lefebvre, the Countess." Poirot's eyes narrowed. The poised, elegant woman with the perfectly calm expression. The one who claimed such violence was unthinkable. The one who had watched the dead man earlier with an attention she hoped no one noticed. Interesting. Poirot thanked the conductor and dismissed him. As the door closed, he stood in the middle of the cabin, letting the puzzle form. Every case began this way, with scattered pieces waiting to be reshaped into truth. Outside the cabin, passengers whispered once again. Poirot stepped into the corridor slowly, observing their worried faces. Some watched him with hope, others with fear, and a few with something else. Calculation. He approached the Countess first. She turned calmly, though her eyes flashed with a faint spark of concern. "Madame," Poirot said softly, "may I trouble you for a brief conversation?" Her smile was polite, controlled, perfect. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot." He led her toward the empty dining car, where only dim lights remained and silence spread like a blanket across the polished tables. She took her seat gracefully, hands folded in her lap. Poirot sat opposite her. "For your understanding," he began, "I must ask everyone some questions. But I wanted to speak with you first, as you had contact with the victim shortly before dinner." Her eyes widened just enough, a reaction too quick to be an act. "You saw us?" "None," Poirot replied. "But the conductor did." The Countess hesitated. Poirot watched every subtle movement, the tightening of her shoulders, the soft inhale, the faint tension around her mouth. She was deciding what version of truth to offer. Finally, she spoke. "Yes, I spoke with him. Only briefly." "What was the nature of your conversation?" She glanced toward the window where snow slammed against the glass. "A matter of unpleasant history," she said at last. "He recognized me and reminded me of something I prefer to forget." Poirot considered her answer. The word unpleasant in her tone carried weight. And this unpleasant history, Poirot pressed gently, was it something that could create resentment? "Not resentment," she replied softly. "Pain." Poirot leaned in slightly. "Madame, did you fear him?" Her gaze dropped to her hands. "I do not fear men like him anymore." An interesting answer, wrapped in emotion she tried to hide. Poirot filed it away, like a puzzle piece. He thanked her and allowed her to return to her cabin. As she walked away, her graceful posture faltered just once, a tiny stumble of hesitation before she regained composure. A sign of guilt? Or trauma? Poirot let the question sit. Next, he interviewed the colonel, the governess, the journalist, the quiet traveler, one by one, peeling back their layers, observing inconsistencies, catching every contradiction. But the most intriguing interview came last. The journalist approached Poirot of his own accord. Notebook in hand, his expression too eager, too hungry. "Mr. Poirot," he said breathlessly, "I want to help you. I'm trained to see details others overlook." Poirot gave him a subtle smile. "And what is it you have noticed, monsieur?" The man leaned closer. The victim wasn't just afraid. He was running. That's why he boarded last minute. I saw him at the station, arguing with someone before he ran to the train. Poirot's brows lifted. Arguing with whom? The journalist hesitated. "I don't know. I only heard a piece of it." Poirot folded his arms. "And that piece was?" The journalist swallowed. "The victim said, 'You can't escape what happened.'" "Not after all these years." Poirot felt a chill, colder than the snowstorm outside. This murder was not about opportunity. It was about history. Old history. Buried history. The kind that crawled out of the past with sharp teeth. He thanked the journalist, though he did not entirely trust him, and dismissed him with a quiet nod. Poirot returned to his own cabin and closed the door gently behind him. Alone now, with only the soft hum of the train's faint engine and the relentless storm raging outside, he allowed the puzzle pieces to rearrange themselves in his mind. A businessman full of fear. A countess with a painful past linked to him. A cryptic argument at the station about a long-ago event. A cabin locked from the inside. A gun left unused. A killer who walked unnoticed among the passengers. Poirot inhaled slowly. Someone on this train committed not a crime of impulse, but a crime of justice. A crime of memory. A crime planned long before the train ever left the station. And somewhere among these passengers, the truth waited, stubborn, buried, ready to fight back. Poirot leaned back in his seat, his eyes sharp, his mind relentless. "Tomorrow," he whispered to himself, "the lies will begin to crack." Outside, the storm howled louder, as if urging him onward. Inside the train, a murderer listened and prepared. The morning light did not arrive gently. Instead, it crept through the frost-covered windows in a cold, pale shimmer, barely warming the air inside the stranded train. Snowdrifts piled high against the Orient Express, swallowing its wheels and sealing it inside a frozen tomb. The passengers woke to a world where escape was impossible and truth had nowhere left to hide. Every creak of the train, every faint whisper, every step in the narrow corridor seemed sharper, heavier, as though the train itself was holding its breath, listening. Hercule Poirot rose early, his mind already racing with questions that twisted together like tangled threads. A night of little rest had done nothing to dull his focus. Instead, it sharpened him. He dressed with quiet precision, straightening his tie, brushing a speck of lint from his sleeve. Investigations demanded order, and he carried that order in everything he did. When he stepped into the corridor, He found the conductor waiting nervously, his hands clasped, eyes wide with a kind of dread that had grown overnight. "Monsieur Poirot," he whispered, "the passengers. They are terrified. They want answers." Poirot nodded calmly. "And they shall have them, but only through cooperation." He requested the dining car be prepared for a gathering. A communal space would force the passengers into the same room, where their eyes, their movements, and their reactions could expose truths far more effectively than words. The conductor hurried away, grateful for the direction. Poirot walked slowly down the corridor, pausing by each door, listening. Behind the thin wooden barriers he heard hushed conversations, hurried whispers, frantic pacing. Everyone was awake. Everyone was afraid. And in that fear, Poirot knew, someone struggled to maintain their composure more than the others. The murderer. He entered the dining car just as the lamps flickered to life. The long tables, lined with crisp white linens, looked oddly out of place amid the rising tension. The room felt colder than usual, not from the storm, but from anticipation. One by one, the passengers arrived, each carrying their own brand of anxiety. The governess, Miss Whitmore, clutched a cup of tea for comfort, though her hands trembled so violently she nearly spilled it. Her eyes darted between passengers, searching for reassurance and finding none. The colonel took his seat with rigid posture, jaw clenched as though he'd spent the night fighting ghosts and losing. His gaze scanned the room like a battlefield, dissecting every expression. The countess entered gracefully, though her usual elegance seemed dimmed by the weight of the night before. Her face was composed, but Poirot could see the subtle tightening around her eyes, a sign of someone wrestling with memories she wished she could bury. The journalist arrived last. Notebook in hand, his excitement barely masked by faux concern. He sat eagerly, ready to collect every detail as though it were treasure. Poirot stood at the head of the table. The murmur of voices died into silence. "Madame and messieurs," he began, "you already know the tragedy we face. A man lies dead, and the storm leaves us with no escape. The killer is among us. Therefore, I ask you to answer my questions with honesty. A lie, no matter how small, will expose itself." The governess flinched. The countess remained still. The colonel stiffened. The journalist clicked his pen. Ready, Poirot focused first on the victim's past, the most dangerous territory. "To solve this crime," he said softly, "we must know who our victim truly was. Not the identity he carried today, but the truths he tried to bury." The colonel cleared his throat. "He was an American businessman. That is all." "No," Poirot said gently, "that is not all. You see, the gentleman carried a false name. A false life, even." The passengers exchanged startled looks. The governess whispered a soft gasp. Poirot turned toward the journalist. "Monsieur, you saw him before he boarded the train, did you not?" The journalist straightened with pride. "Yes." He looked panicked, desperate. "He argued with a man outside the station." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Tell them what you heard." The journalist repeated the sentence he'd shared with Poirot earlier. "You can't escape what happened." "Not after all these years." A heavy silence fell over the table. Poirot allowed the words to sink in like poison. The colonel's fingers drummed on the table. The countess stared into her untouched tea. Miss Whitmore swallowed nervously. Poirot moved closer, his voice low but firm. "Our victim was not running from a recent mistake. He was running from a crime buried in his past, one that someone here remembers very well." The countess closed her eyes briefly, a gesture of pain. The colonel's jaw tightened. A gesture of anger. Miss Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. A gesture of fear. Poirot observed them all. Storing reactions like evidence, he began the individual questioning, starting with Miss Whitmore. She looked fragile enough to crack under a single harsh word. "Miss Whitmore," Poirot said gently, "last night, did you leave your cabin?" Her eyes widened. No. I stayed in my room. I was reading. Poirot watched her carefully. Her voice trembled. Her fingers toyed with her necklace. Did you hear anything unusual? She hesitated, then whispered, I heard footsteps, and I thought I heard someone whispering in the corridor. Whispering what? Poirot pressed. I don't know. It was too faint. He believed she heard something. He didn't believe she stayed in her cabin. Next, he turned to the colonel. The man met Poirot's gaze without flinching. Colonel, Poirot began, what is your impression of the victim? A coward, the colonel said bluntly. A man who lived his life cheating others. I saw it the moment he walked into the dining car. Poirot lifted an eyebrow. Strong judgment for a man you barely knew. The colonel looked away. Men like him are familiar. Poirot leaned closer. Too familiar? The colonel offered no answer, which was answer enough. Poirot moved next to the countess. Her poise was admirable, but Poirot saw the cracks beneath the surface. Madame, Poirot said softly, you admitted last night to having a painful history with the victim. She inhaled deeply. Yes, but I did not kill him. Poirot did not respond immediately. Instead, he asked, this history, does it involve betrayal? Her eyes glistened with restrained emotion. It involves loss. A chill ran through the room. Poirot stepped away. Giving her space. Finally, he approached the journalist. Monsieur, Poirot said. You seem eager to assist. The journalist smiled nervously. Well, a story like this. A murder is not a story, monsieur, Poirot interrupted gently. Not until justice is served. The journalist swallowed hard. Shrinking under Poirot's gaze, Poirot stepped back to the center of the dining car. He had heard enough. Each of you, he said quietly, is hiding something. Not necessarily murder, but secrets. And secrets, Ms. Amos, are the soil in which motive grows. He paused, but one of you is hiding more. One of you carries the truth behind this man's death. A whisper of unease rippled through the group. Poirot continued. Voice calm yet piercing. The victim's suitcase contained clues, a torn envelope, a coded notebook, even a weapon he was too frightened to use. These items are not random. They are part of a past crime that links him to someone here. He let the silence stretch. Today, I will uncover that link. Piece by piece. The colonel shifted. The countess looked down. Miss Whitmore breathed shakily. The journalist scribbled nervously. Poirot saw everything. When the meeting concluded, the passengers dispersed once more, each returning to the safety of their compartments, or the illusion of safety. Fear had tightened around them like a vice. Poirot stood alone in the dining car for a long moment. Reflecting, he finally murmured to himself, the truth approaches. It always does. He then stepped into the corridor and caught a glimpse of something just before it vanished behind a corner. A shadow. A movement. Someone who had been listening. Someone who did not wish to be seen. Poirot's lips curved into a subtle smile. The murderer was beginning to panic. And panic makes liars careless. The train hurtled through the night. Its rhythmic clatter, a steady heartbeat that seemed to echo the tension lingering in the air. Hercule Poirot sat quietly in his compartment, his sharp eyes following every subtle movement of the passengers he had already begun to suspect. The past few hours had yielded fragments of truths, half-lies, and peculiar observations, each one a thread that could unravel the entire web of deception surrounding the murder of the distinguished Mr. Astor. Yet, as the moonlight swept across the polished surfaces of the train, Poirot sensed that the strands he had gathered were only the beginning. The murderer's cunning was not merely in action, but in omission. The silence of certain passengers spoke volumes louder than their words ever could. Poirot's mind was a whirl of deduction, each detail colliding with another until a pattern began to emerge, one that was both intricate and disturbingly deliberate. There was the elderly lady, Mrs. Whittaker, whose trembling hands concealed more than they revealed. There was the young man, Mr. Linton, whose nervous glances suggested a familiarity with secrets too heavy for his years. Even the seemingly innocuous conductor held subtle nuances in his posture and speech that could not escape Poirot's piercing gaze. Every compartment was a stage, every passenger a potential actor in a drama that had already turned deadly dot as he carefully observed from the small compartment window. Poirot noted the shadows cast by the passing trees, elongating and twisting in a manner that mirrored the convoluted lies among his fellow travelers. He mused upon the psychological warfare that had unfolded, at how fear and guilt could manipulate the truth, and how the faintest hesitation in a response could betray a soul's hidden agenda. The more he considered the human element of this crime, the clearer it became that the solution would not be found merely in physical evidence, but in understanding the intricate dance of motives, relationships, and suppressed truths. Suddenly, a sound reached him, almost imperceptible over the train's steady hum. It was a soft whisper, perhaps even a sigh, from the corridor outside his compartment. Poirot's hand moved ever so slightly toward the door, but he did not rise. Instead, he allowed his mind to race ahead, imagining the possibilities. Had someone been watching him, aware that his little gray cells were piecing together the puzzle? Or was this merely another layer of illusion, a test to see if the detective could be unnerved? He smiled faintly. Such theatrics did not frighten Hercule Poirot. They merely sharpened his concentration, bringing the culprit one step closer to exposure. Meanwhile, the other passengers seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of suspicion running through the train. Conversations continued, polite and superficial, punctuated by laughter that sounded forced to Poirot's sensitive ears. A cup of tea was passed here, a shared anecdote there, but beneath it all simmered the tension of unspoken truths. Poirot reflected on the human tendency to maintain appearances, how the mundane rituals of daily life could mask the darkest of intentions. It was precisely within these ordinary routines that the extraordinary motives hid, waiting to be revealed by an attentive observer. As the train slowed briefly at a small, dimly lit station, Poirot caught sight of a figure slipping discreetly along the platform, a man, tall and deliberately nondescript, whose presence seemed almost an afterthought. Yet Poirot's instinct told him otherwise. Every detail mattered: the angle of the man's hat, the careful placement of his gloves, even the slight hitch in his gait. These were not mere coincidences. The man's discreet exit, perfectly timed and almost casual, hinted at knowledge of the train's schedule and the passengers' movements. Poirot made a mental note. This man, whoever he was, might either be an accomplice or a pivotal witness. Returning to the compartment, Poirot's attention was drawn to a letter left carelessly on the table by one of the passengers. Mrs. Whittaker. Its edges were crisp, its handwriting precise. Yet there was a certain urgency in the flow of the script that betrayed inner turmoil. Poirot carefully picked it up, examining each word for hidden clues. The content was seemingly innocuous, a correspondence about an upcoming social gathering. But the subtext, the careful avoidance of certain names, the subtle hints at meetings arranged under vague pretenses, revealed a network of connections that demanded further scrutiny. Here, in the quietest of moments, the threads of deceit began to form a clearer pattern. The hours passed with deliberate, measured progression. Poirot, ever methodical, began reconstructing the timeline of the murder with meticulous attention. He considered the precise moment the victim had been struck down, the placement of objects in the compartment, the subtle discrepancies in alibis, and the fleeting gestures of those who had feigned innocence. Each observation was a brushstroke in a growing portrait of guilt, a canvas painted in shades of anxiety and concealed malice. It was an art as much as it was a science, and Poirot, with his unparalleled insight into human nature, was beginning to see the complete tableau. Then, A breakthrough arrived in the form of an overheard conversation. Poirot, having stationed himself discreetly near the corridor, caught fragments of dialogue between Mr. Linton and another young man whose identity remained obscured. Words like cover, timing, and retribution floated to him, revealing a plot more elaborate than previously imagined. Poirot's heart did not race. He never allowed emotion to cloud his judgment, but a quiet satisfaction settled in him. The final pieces were beginning to align, the intricate weave of lies and half-truths slowly unspooling to reveal the sinister reality beneath. In a moment of contemplative solitude, Poirot reflected on the psychological dimensions of the crime. It was not merely a matter of greed or revenge. The murderer's actions were informed by complex interpersonal dynamics, by grudges and perceived slights accumulated over years. Each passenger, knowingly or unknowingly, played a role in the environment that allowed murder to occur. Understanding the subtleties of human behavior, the fear, the pride, the vanity was as essential as analyzing fingerprints or footprints. Poirot's genius lay not only in his observation of external evidence, but in his comprehension of the invisible forces shaping human decisions. The night deepened, and with it, the sense of impending revelation. Poirot, moving with quiet deliberation, made his rounds of the train, engaging in brief, seemingly casual conversations with each passenger. To the untrained eye, his questions were harmless, even banal, yet each response was a test, a probe into the consistency of stories and the authenticity of demeanor. Some answered with nervous precision, others with carefully constructed deflection, and a few, remarkably, with candid simplicity that hinted at innocence or clever misdirection. Poirot catalogued each reaction, storing them like precious artifacts to be examined. When the time was right, hours merged seamlessly as the train sped across the countryside. The darkness outside punctuated only by the fleeting lights of distant stations. Inside, the atmosphere was taut with suspense, a tension that Poirot could almost physically feel. He was aware that the murderer was not only hiding, but actively manipulating the situation, attempting to steer suspicion away from themselves. Yet Poirot's confidence never wavered. He knew that every deception left traces, and every carefully guarded secret had a shadow. The task was to follow these shadows, to see beyond appearances and into the hidden corridors of human intent. Finally, as the first pale light of dawn began to seep into the compartments, Poirot felt the familiar thrill of nearing a solution. The pieces, each small and seemingly insignificant on their own, now coalesced into a coherent narrative. The motive, the method, and the opportunity all aligned with the subtle fingerprints of human emotion and cunning strategy. He allowed himself a brief smile, savoring the anticipation of confronting the murderer. It was a delicate dance, one requiring precision, tact, and an unerring understanding of the human psyche. And Poirot, with his unmatched ability to navigate both observation and intuition, was ready to step into the final act. The passengers, unaware of the detective's inner resolution, continued their morning routines, sipping tea, exchanging polite greetings, and gazing absent-mindedly out of the windows at the passing landscape. Yet beneath this veneer of calm, the invisible threads of tension had been woven tighter than ever. Poirot, seated with his notebook discreetly open and his mind alert to every nuance, felt the weight of imminent revelation. The journey was far from over, but the direction was now unmistakable. The truth lay ahead, shrouded in layers of deception, waiting for the precise moment when the smallest of gestures would unravel the complex tapestry of lies. As the train approached a major junction, Poirot stood and straightened his coat, preparing to confront the passengers with questions that would illuminate the shadows. He knew that one by one, the walls of deceit would crumble, revealing the intricate network of relationships, motives, and actions that had culminated in murder. Every glance, every word, every hesitation was part of the grand puzzle, and Poirot was poised to fit the pieces together. The legendary detective's mind, ever vigilant and brilliant, was ready to expose the darkness hiding in plain sight, bringing justice to the fallen and clarity to the bewildered Dot in that quiet yet charged moment. The train itself seemed to pause, as though sensing the approach of revelation. The steady rhythm of its wheels, once a comforting constant, now seemed to echo the heartbeat of suspense building within each compartment. Poirot's eyes scanned the faces of the passengers, noting the micro-expressions, the flicker of fear, the shadow of guilt, the calm of those truly innocent. Each subtle detail was a clue, each reaction a piece of the puzzle. And as the train pressed onward toward the next station, Poirot felt certain that the truth, long concealed, was finally on the verge of exposure. The morning sunlight filtered weakly through the train's narrow windows, casting long, uneven shadows across the compartments. The quiet hum of the engine had taken on a different quality in Poirot's ears. It was no longer just a background rhythm, but a marker of the suspenseful march toward revelation. The passengers, seemingly immersed in their own small worlds, were unaware that the detective's mind had already begun to reconstruct the murder in its entirety, tracing each subtle action, each hesitant glance, and every whispered exchange. The killer had underestimated one thing: the precision of Hercule Poirot's observation. Poirot began his morning by walking the length of the train with measured steps, his polished shoes making soft taps on the floor, yet every movement purposeful. He greeted the passengers politely, his questions framed as casual conversation, but each inquiry was a calculated test, designed to probe for inconsistencies and hidden truths. Some answered quickly, too quickly, giving themselves away in the blink of an eye. Others offered elaborate stories, weaving half-truths into seemingly convincing narratives, yet each tale left small pauses that revealed more than words ever could. Poirot catalogued everything meticulously, noting even the subtlest signs of discomfort or hesitation. In the dining car, a cluster of passengers gathered, discussing trivialities with laughter that sounded hollow to Poirot's sensitive ears. The young Mr. Linton lingered near a table, nervously adjusting his cufflinks as if each movement might betray his internal unrest. Across the room, Mrs. Whittaker sat composed, but the faint tremor in her hand as she held her teacup did not escape Poirot's notice. Even the conductor, who moved with the efficient calm of a man accustomed to oversight, exhibited micro-expressions of vigilance, an indication that he knew more than he admitted. Every glance, every subtle gesture, was a piece in the mosaic of truth that Poirot was slowly assembling. The detective's thoughts returned to the murder itself. He replayed the night in his mind, imagining each passenger's possible movements and motives, considering the opportunity and means available to them. The timing of the crime had been precise, almost orchestrated, suggesting not a spontaneous act but a calculated, deliberate plan. The victim, Mr. Astor, had been a man of discernment, able to read human character with keen insight, yet even he had been outmaneuvered by someone equally cunning. Poirot understood that unraveling the layers of deception required both the patience to observe and the Poirot understood that unraveling the layers of deception required both the patience to observe, and the Poirot understood that unraveling the potion, imagination to anticipate the murderer's thought process. Suddenly, Poirot's attention was drawn to a scrap of paper lying near the window of a small compartment. Picking it up with gloved hands, he noted the hurried handwriting, the uneven spacing of words, and the subtle ink smudges. It appeared to be a note of urgency, a clandestine communication that had been forgotten or intentionally left behind. The content hinted at a meeting between two passengers under the cover of night, a rendezvous that had escaped notice, and yet its implications were clear. The murder was part of a wider plot, involving collusion and hidden agendas. Poirot carefully tucked the note into his coat pocket, knowing it would serve as a critical clue in his unfolding investigation. As the train curved along a distant hillside, The detective returned to his compartment, seated himself at the small table, and began piecing together the narrative. The murder was not merely an isolated incident, it was the culmination of a chain of events, each influenced by ambition, jealousy, and fear. Poirot reflected on the human element, how pride could blind judgment, how fear could drive deception, and how the desire for retribution could mask even the simplest truths. Each passenger, willingly or unwittingly, played a role in creating the environment in which the crime had occurred. Understanding these subtleties, Poirot knew, was as vital as analyzing physical evidence. Then, a revelation struck him as he recalled a brief exchange overheard the night before. Two passengers had spoken in hushed tones, referencing a cover and the timing of events. Their words, initially inconsequential, now revealed a coordinated effort, a conspiracy that went beyond the obvious motives. Poirot realized that the murderer had manipulated not only the scene of the crime, but also the perceptions of the other passengers, creating an elaborate illusion of innocence. The detective allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The puzzle was not yet complete, but the edges were clearly defined. And the central piece, the identity of the killer, was within reach. Poirot decided it was time to employ one of his subtle but effective strategies. He would provoke the passengers, without arousing suspicion, into revealing inconsistencies in their stories. Small, seemingly innocuous comments would act as catalysts, triggering reactions that could not be faked. This method, honed over years of solving the most intricate of crimes, relied on the interplay of human psychology, the twitch of an eyebrow, the hesitation before a response, or the fleeting shadow of guilt in a smile. Poirot's mind was attuned to these nuances, each one sharpening the image of the truth. By mid-morning, the detective had gathered the passengers in the lounge under the guise of casual conversation. The tension in the room was palpable, though the passengers were unaware of its source. Poirot, seated with impeccable posture, allowed the conversation to flow, carefully steering it toward innocuous topics that would, under scrutiny, reveal more than they seemed. Questions about schedules, past meetings, and minor incidents were asked with an air of casual curiosity, yet each answer was meticulously analyzed. Some responded with ease, revealing nothing. Others faltered, their discomfort betraying knowledge of the crime. Each response was a step closer to unmasking the murderer. Poirot's mind returned again to Mrs. Whittaker, whose composure was nearly flawless yet who had left the mysterious note behind. The tremor in her hand, the urgency of her writing, and the avoidance of certain topics in conversation suggested that she was more deeply involved than she admitted. Likewise, Mr. Linton's anxious demeanor and repeated glances toward the corridor hinted at concealed knowledge or participation. Poirot began forming hypotheses, each contingent on cross-verification, ready to test them through observation and subtle questioning. As the train approached another station, Poirot observed the movements of the passengers with renewed intensity. The man he had noticed slipping along the platform the previous night was nowhere to be seen, yet his presence had left an indelible mark on Poirot's analysis. The detective considered the possibility of an accomplice, someone who had orchestrated events behind the scenes, directing suspicion while remaining hidden. The depth of deception was greater than he had anticipated, but Poirot's confidence remained unwavering. Every detail, however minute, was a clue. Every seemingly trivial gesture, a revelation waiting to occur. The afternoon passed in meticulous scrutiny. Poirot visited each compartment under various pretexts, conversing lightly, observing reactions, and noting discrepancies. Some passengers seemed increasingly uneasy, their composure eroding under the subtle pressure of his inquiries. The detective recorded everything mentally, arranging the observations into patterns, cross-referencing alibis, and identifying contradictions. Each interaction, no matter how mundane, brought him closer to the inescapable truth. The web of deceit, intricate and carefully constructed, was beginning to fray at the edges. By evening, Poirot felt the momentum of the investigation shift in his favor. He had identified multiple inconsistencies, traced concealed movements, and begun to understand the complex interplay of relationships and motives. The murder was no longer a puzzle shrouded in uncertainty. It was a deliberate act, executed with calculated precision, and he could now see the hand of the culprit guiding the events. His attention turned to the final challenge, confronting the murderer, ensuring that each step would elicit the necessary revelations without alerting them prematurely. As darkness settled across the landscape outside, Poirot prepared for the culmination of his observations. He understood that the final act required careful orchestration, for a misstep could allow the culprit to retreat into shadows once more. He reviewed every note, every gesture, every fragment of overheard conversation, arranging them into a coherent strategy. The detective's mind, always methodical, was now focused on the subtle art of exposure, the precision timing of questions, and the deliberate sequencing of revelations that would leave the murderer with nowhere to hide. Poirot's anticipation was tempered by patience, the hallmark of his investigative style. He knew that the resolution was imminent. The threads of lies, carefully interwoven by the murderer, were beginning to unravel under the scrutiny of his unerring insight. Each passenger, knowingly or unknowingly, would soon play a part in the revelation. The detective's reputation for unmasking the truth, no matter how cleverly concealed, was about to be reaffirmed once more, and the legendary mind of Hercule Poirot stood ready to illuminate the shadows that had long cloaked the sea. Night had fallen once again, and the train moved steadily through the darkness, its wheels striking the tracks with a rhythmic insistence that echoed Poirot's own relentless focus. The detective sat in his compartment, reviewing every observation, every note, every subtle gesture he had witnessed over the past day. Each detail was a thread in the intricate tapestry of deception that had culminated in murder, and Poirot now felt the tension of these threads drawing tight, ready to snap under the weight of revelation. The passengers, unaware of the scrutiny they were under, moved about the train in polite monotony, their conversations light but strained, betraying the anxiety of those who carried secrets too heavy to admit. Poirot's mind returned again to Mrs. Whittaker, whose careful demeanor concealed tremors of fear and urgency. The note she had left behind had been a critical clue, hinting at clandestine interactions with other passengers and suggesting that her role in the night's events was far more involved than outward appearances suggested. Poirot considered her motivations carefully: pride, fear, perhaps guilt. Yet he knew that motives alone were insufficient. The proof lay in connections, in timing, in the subtle choreography of actions and reactions. Each observation he had made now began to interlock, forming a lattice of evidence that pointed unmistakably toward the true architect of the crime. The young Mr. Linton, too, remained a figure of suspicion. His nervous glances, repeated adjustments of clothing, and occasional hesitations in speech were small but significant indicators. Poirot reflected on the psychology of the guilty, the compulsive need to monitor reactions, the delicate management of alibis, the subconscious flickers of self-incrimination in casual gestures. Linton's behavior, in Poirot's experienced judgment, suggested more than mere apprehension. It hinted at knowledge, involvement, or at least complicity in a complex plan that extended beyond a single act of violence. Poirot decided it was time to observe the dynamics between passengers more directly. He moved discreetly through the corridors, listening, noting the placement of bodies and belongings, and quietly assessing interactions. In one compartment, a brief but telling exchange between two passengers revealed concealed tension. A shared glance, a subtle stiffening of posture, and a measured avoidance of direct eye contact. These small indicators, easily missed by the untrained observer, spoke volumes to Poirot. Here, in these silences, lay the essence of the crime, the unspoken agreements, the hidden resentments, and the covert machinations that had led to murder. The detective's attention was drawn to an empty compartment, where a recently vacated piece of luggage lay abandoned. Its contents were ordinary, yet the absence of certain expected items suggested hasty packing or the deliberate concealment of evidence. Poirot considered the implications. Who had left the luggage? Why had it been left behind, and what did it conceal about the movements of the person in question? In Poirot's mind, every object was a witness, every absence a testimony. The train itself had become a stage upon which the drama of truth and deceit was being silently enacted. Each compartment a microcosm of hidden human motives. Returning to his own compartment, Poirot began to systematically reconstruct the timeline of events. He traced each passenger's movements, cross-referenced statements, and aligned observations of behavior with the physical evidence of the night. A pattern emerged, complex, layered, but coherent. The murderer's plan had been elegant in its design, exploiting both the structure of the train and the psychological tendencies of the passengers. Yet elegance, Poirot knew, could not withstand the precision of careful deduction. Every act, no matter how cunning, left traces, and he was attuned to find them. The moment of revelation approached subtly in the quiet of the night. Poirot noticed a series of small gestures, the adjustment of a sleeve, the avoidance of eye contact with certain passengers, the overemphasis on casual conversation to mask tension. Each was a silent thread, connecting actions with intent, revealing the hidden framework of deceit. The detective understood that confrontation must be deliberate. The murderer, if approached prematurely, could retreat further into shadows, destroying the delicate balance of observation and proof. Patience, he reminded himself, was the instrument of justice. Poirot prepared to set his strategy in motion. He would provoke confessions not through accusation but through suggestion, guiding the passengers to reveal the inconsistencies themselves. By carefully orchestrating questions and observations, he intended to illuminate the web of lies while maintaining the guise of casual interaction. Each subtle nudge would serve as a mirror, reflecting the truth back to the guilty party, until denial could no longer mask reality. The detective's mind worked with meticulous clarity, envisioning each interaction, predicting responses, and anticipating attempts at deception. The first test came in the form of a brief gathering in the lounge car, where the passengers were invited under pretense of casual conversation. Poirot steered the discussion lightly, introducing topics that seemed innocuous but were designed to expose contradictions. Some passengers responded with ease, revealing nothing. Others hesitated, fumbled, or contradicted themselves, each slip a signpost pointing toward culpability. Poirot observed these signs carefully, mentally recording the micro-expressions, the subtle shifts in posture, and the faint quivers of the voice that betrayed hidden truths. By the early hours of morning, Poirot had assembled a clear understanding of the interplay between all key individuals. The murder, far from being a singular, isolated act, was the result of a complex series of interactions and manipulations, with each participant unknowingly or deliberately contributing to the fatal outcome. The detective reflected on the layers of human emotion involved: jealousy, pride, fear, and vengeance, each coloring actions and intentions. The subtle choreography of deceit had created a perfect storm, yet Poirot's unerring insight had begun to pierce the veil. Finally, Poirot was ready to confront the guilty party. With careful precision, he summoned the passengers to the main observation car, under the guise of reviewing travel arrangements and schedules. The atmosphere was deceptively calm, yet tension ran thick beneath the polite veneer. Poirot addressed the group with gentle but pointed questions, guiding them toward revelations without forcing admission. He observed reactions closely, the tightening of fists, the avoidance of gaze, the barely perceptible tremors, all signs that the web of deceit was beginning to unravel. Poirot's brilliance lay not only in his observation but in his ability to synthesize. psychological and factual evidence. He could read the invisible lines connecting motive to action, fear to confession, and deception to guilt. By orchestrating the conversation, he ensured that the truth would emerge organically, that each passenger would unwittingly illuminate the hidden framework of the crime. In that moment, the detective felt the quiet satisfaction of nearing resolution, knowing that the culmination of his careful deductions was imminent, and that justice would soon claim its due. The final hours passed with slow deliberation. Poirot guided, questioned, observed, and waited. And then, in a fleeting but unmistakable gesture, the slightest hesitation, the faintest falter, the guilty party revealed themselves. Not through words, but through the silent threads of truth that Poirot had patiently traced. The detective leaned back, allowing the revelation to settle, confident that the intricate puzzle he had so methodically assembled was now complete. The shadows of deceit had been exposed, and the murderer's carefully constructed facade had begun to crumble under the weight of observation, deduction, and unerring insight. The train glided quietly through the night, a gentle hum accompanying the tension that had steadily accumulated over the past days. Hercule Poirot, seated with immaculate poise, surveyed the passengers with a penetrating gaze. Every minute gesture, every micro-expression, every nuance of speech had been catalogued in his mind, forming an intricate map of truths, half-truths, and outright lies. The time had come, the moment when observation alone would no longer suffice, and the careful orchestration of revelation would force the shadows in Poirot began with a subtle maneuver. He engaged the group in casual conversation in the observation car, his questions light and unassuming, yet each carried the weight of precision. Topics drifted from trivial socialities to the passengers' recollections of the previous night's events. Some responded with ease, others with cautious hesitation. Poirot's eyes flickered from one face to another, noting every flicker of unease, every fleeting sign of guilt. He did not rush. A single misstep could alert the guilty party. Patience was as important as insight, and Poirot had honed both to perfection. The first cracks appeared in Mr. Linton's composure. The young man's voice wavered, and his careful responses betrayed subtle inconsistencies. Poirot's gaze remained calm and penetrating, as if he could peer straight into the hidden recesses of Linton's thoughts. He gently probed, raising questions about the passengers' interactions and their movements during the night. Each question was a gentle nudge, yet it struck at the core of the hidden network of lies. Poirot observed the young man's reactions, the blink too rapid, the twitch of a hand, the sudden flush on his cheeks, all indicators that the threads of truth were beginning to unravel. Mrs. Whittaker's composure, though impressive, began to falter as Poirot skillfully guided the conversation. Her eyes shifted, her hands tightened around her teacup, and the careful rhythm of her speech was punctuated by pauses that suggested an inner turmoil she could not entirely conceal. Poirot's attention to detail allowed him to interpret these subtle signals. Every hesitation, every momentary lapse in control, added to the growing picture of the night's events, confirming connections that had been obscured by deliberate deception. The detective then employed a strategy he had mastered over decades, the art of suggestion. Without accusation, he began narrating the sequence of the murder in general terms, presenting hypotheticals as mere reflections of possibility. Yet each scenario was constructed to test reactions, to provoke involuntary responses that betrayed guilt. The room seemed to contract under the weight of tension, though outwardly it remained calm and polite. Eyes darted furtively, hands tightened, and unspoken acknowledgments passed between the guilty and their unsuspected accomplices. Poirot observed with the quiet satisfaction of one orchestrating a precise, delicate instrument. The pivotal moment arrived when Poirot subtly focused attention on the note found earlier, a seemingly innocuous scrap of writing whose implications had become far clearer with his thorough investigation. He mentioned it casually, allowing the guilty party to respond naturally. The slight hesitation, the way Mrs. Whittaker's hand twitched, and the barely perceptible shift in her posture revealed that the note had been deliberately left as part of the larger scheme, a silent signal between co-conspirators. Poirot's mind, swift and methodical, connected the threads, motive, opportunity, and action aligned perfectly in his reasoning. Poirot then brought the focus to the timing of the murder, carefully recounting observations, discrepancies in alibis, and subtle gestures witnessed the night before. The detective's voice remained calm, his tone gentle yet undeniable in its authority. The room's polite facade began to crumble. Mr. Linton's anxious glances could no longer be masked, and Mrs. Whittaker's carefully maintained composure faltered under the weight of scrutiny. The web of deceit, so carefully woven, was unraveling before Poirot's discerning eyes. He allowed moments of silence to press, knowing that the guilty mind would seek to fill them, often betraying itself in the process. The final piece fell into place when Poirot observed an almost imperceptible exchange between two passengers, previously overlooked in the hustle of observation. A glance, a subtle nod, the tiniest shift of posture, small, seemingly trivial, yet pregnant with meaning. Poirot recognized the choreography of complicity. The murder had not been a solitary act, but a collaborative orchestration, carried out with precision and hidden under layers of polite conversation and careful misdirection. The detective's intuition, honed to perfection, had deciphered the silent language of guilt. With all evidence assembled and the room tense with anticipation, Poirot leaned forward, addressing the guilty party with his signature calm authority. He recounted the sequence of events, the connections between passengers, and the subtle clues that had revealed the orchestration behind the murder. Each observation was stated matter-of-factly, yet each carried undeniable weight. The guilty party's reactions betrayed them immediately: a falter in voice, a sudden constriction of the chest, eyes darting as the inevitable realization settled in. The detective's deductions were inescapable. The truth, as meticulously constructed in Poirot's mind, now stood before all. Poirot allowed the moment to linger, giving the guilty individual space to comprehend the exposure. The passengers watched, a mixture of relief, shock, and awe etched across their faces as the careful, patient work of the legendary detective brought clarity to the chaos of fear, deception, and murder. The once concealed truth emerged fully into the light, each subtle action and gesture now understood as part of a deliberate, calculated plan. Poirot's brilliance lay not merely in observation, but in his ability to weave together the human, psychological, and material evidence into a cohesive narrative. Finally, the room breathed in a shared recognition. The murderer had been unmasked. Silence filled the space briefly before it was punctuated by the soft acknowledgement of truth. The detective's calm demeanor contrasted with the intensity of revelation, but his eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of justice achieved. The passengers, relieved yet contemplative, began to understand the depth of deception that had occurred under their very noses, and the masterful unraveling orchestrated by Hercule Poirot. The morning light broke over the horizon, spilling gold, and rose across the countryside as the train rolled steadily toward its final destination. Hercule Poirot sat with his hands folded neatly, observing the passengers now visibly transformed by the events of the previous night. Relief and unease mingled in their expressions, a testament to the tension that had gripped the train for days. Yet one face remained subdued, pale, and tense: the murderer, finally confronted and forced into acknowledgement by the inescapable clarity of Poirot's deductions. The silence in the observation car was profound, the kind that follows the shattering of illusions. Where every hidden truth now lay bare, Poirot began the final exposition, speaking with measured calm, his words carrying both authority and precision. He recounted the timeline of the murder, the subtle manipulations, And the small details, each inconsequential on its own, but together forming a clear path to guilt. Every micro-expression, hesitation, and misdirection that had initially confused the investigation was now illuminated, woven into a narrative that no one could dispute. Poirot's skill lay not merely in solving the crime, but in revealing the hidden layers of human nature, showing how pride, fear, and greed could twist behavior into lethal outcomes. He addressed the passengers with quiet dignity, explaining how each played a role, some unwitting, some deliberate, in the unfolding of events. The murderer, once confident in anonymity and manipulation, now showed signs of undeniable surrender. Poirot's precise recounting of the subtle cues, the note left behind, the brief exchanges of glances, the nervous gestures, the inconsistencies in alibis, exposed the carefully constructed deception. There was no escape from the web of logic and observation that Poirot had spun. Truth had finally prevailed. The room held its collective breath as Poirot revealed the motive, a mixture of jealousy, resentment, and the desire for control. The intricate planning, the careful timing, and the manipulations of human behavior had all served to conceal the crime. But the detective had anticipated each move, reading not only the facts but the human psychology behind them. He described how pride and fear had forced errors, how even the most meticulous planning could not survive the scrutiny of observation and insight. The passengers listened, captivated and awed by the precision of the detective's mind. Poirot's final observations brought closure to the bewildered passengers. He addressed loose ends, clarifying minor suspicions, identifying innocent passengers' misinterpretations, and explaining the interplay of deception that had misled them. Every detail, no matter how trivial, was accounted for, reinforcing the completeness of the investigation. In this methodical unraveling, Poirot demonstrated not only justice, but the elegance of truth revealed through intellect and patience. The passengers' respect for his genius was palpable, and even those implicated felt the inevitability of their exposure, tempered by the fairness of the detective's presentation. The murderer, cornered by logic and exposed by observation, now had no choice but to submit to the consequences. There was a resigned acknowledgement in their eyes, a recognition that cunning alone could not withstand Poirot's brilliance. The detective's calm demeanor and precise articulation of events had stripped away the veneer of innocence, revealing the moral clarity that justice demanded. Poirot allowed this silence to linger, letting the weight of understanding settle over all. Before concluding definitively, the mystery had been solved, the perpetrator revealed, and the threads of deception unraveled completely. As the train approached its final station, the passengers absorbed the resolution with a mixture of relief and contemplation. Conversations resumed, tentative but warmer, as the shared understanding of truth replaced the shadow of fear. Poirot, ever composed, collected his notes and prepared for disembarkation. He reflected briefly on the human dimensions of the case, how pride, greed, fear, and ambition intertwined to create tragedy, and how careful observation, psychological insight, and intellectual rigor could restore order to chaos. The detective's mind, though already turning to future cases, savored the satisfaction of a perfectly solved crime. Finally, as the train slowed to a halt and the passengers gathered their belongings, Poirot allowed himself a subtle smile. The journey, fraught with suspense, deception, and danger, had ended in clarity and justice. Each individual now understood the consequences of their actions or inactions, and the rightful balance of accountability had been restored. Hercule Poirot, the legendary detective, had once again demonstrated the unmatched power of reason, observation, and psychological acumen, leaving no shadow unexamined and no lie unchecked. The murder, complex and cunning, had been unraveled on the rails, leaving behind a legacy of truth, justice, and the quiet brilliance of the detective who had seen through it all. as passengers disembarked into the fresh light of day. Poirot remained momentarily aboard the train, surveying the quiet compartments one last time. Each item, each gesture, each shadow held meaning in his memory. He knew that human nature, in all its complexity, would continue to challenge and intrigue him, but for now, the case was closed. Justice had been served, and the legendary detective walked away with the serene certainty that the truth, once revealed, could not be undone. The train's journey had ended, but Poirot's journey in pursuit of truth continued, ever vigilant, ever brilliant, and forever unyielding in the face of deception.